We have holdouts, we have trade demands, and now we have hamstring injuries. So we have a lot to update here with these top 24 rankings. But starting off at 1, Jefferson stays the same, right? Going to be super brief. What's there to talk about? He had the number 1 wide receiver season for any 23-year-old player we've ever seen. Literally the only 23-year-old to ever average over 100 receiving yards per game. This is someone that going into this next season has a legitimate chance at hitting 2,000 receiving yards in a single year. I mean, what's the real downside case with Jefferson, right? You draft him at pick 1, and then instead of being the number 1 overall wide receiver, boo-hoo, instead maybe he's only the wide receiver 5. Still, you're not going to lose your league by drafting a top 5 wide receiver in the first round. The floor-ceiling combo that you have with a player like Justin Jefferson is absurd, and that's why, in my mind, he has to go ahead and he has to be at this top spot. Now, our next guy, with Ja'Marr Chase, I do want to put a little asterisk on, in that if you are playing in a very shallow redraft format, I do think you can move the wide receivers down just a bit. And how I classify that is if you're playing in a league where you only start 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a tight end, and a flex, their wide receivers are going to be easy to find in the middle rounds at strong values. And maybe you're going to use a tiebreaker to go with an elite tight end in round 1, or maybe you want to go out there and grab your RB, especially if you're going to be playing in a 10-team league instead of a 12-team league, or if you're going to be playing in an 8-team league instead of a 12-team format. But in general, I think you can't really go wrong with Ja'Marr Chase, another wide receiver that has the possibility of cracking 2,000 receiving yards this next year. So wide receiver that this past season had a 31% team target share. Yes, a 31% team target share on a per game basis with one of the best quarterbacks in the entire NFL. Now, of course, we're going to have to monitor the calf strain from Joe Burrow, but as it looks today, I mean, Joe Burrow is most likely going to be good to go week 1. You really don't have a downside case with Ja'Marr Chase. It's kind of a similar situation to Jefferson, right? If you take Ja'Marr Chase round 1, what's the real downside? He's the wide receiver 5 instead of the wide receiver 2. Are we really crying about it? You can still win your league easily if that happens, so I'm fine with it. If we look at all wide receivers since the year 2000 to have a similar rookie and sophomore year trajectory that you had from Ja'Marr Chase, according to RotoViz, we're looking at Ja'Marr Chase, Justin Jefferson, Juju Smith-Schuster, Michael Thomas, AJ Green, as well as Marquise Colston. Now, going over to our next guy, Christian McCaffrey is that player that, like I was saying, if you're playing in an extremely shallow format, you can move up a little bit if you want to. But nonetheless, this is a running back that is not the same player he once was in 2019. Now, still clearly, I have him very high. I have him as the running back 1 overall. But, I mean, he's not going to go out there and get you 150 total yards per game again. He can still definitely get you 100. He can probably have a little bit more touchdown upside now that he's in a much better offense as well. But as I've discussed, you have to be a little bit hesitant whenever you're going to go ahead and look at the usage between CMC as well as Elijah Mitchell. Throughout his entire history of being a head coach, Kyle Shanahan has deployed his running backs in a running back by committee, and this didn't really change this past year in games where Elijah Mitchell was healthy. In those contests, Elijah Mitchell actually had a decent sized role, and CMC only averaged 10.5 carries per game in comparison to 15.5 carries per game with no Elijah Mitchell. Now, with that being said, CMC is still clearly the running back 1 based off his receiving down usage. But I mean, even if we're going to go look at the player props on Underdog, right? I mean, this gives us a sense of what you should expect between the split with these 2 backs. If we look at Christian McCaffrey, he's at 599.5 receiving yards. He's at 865.5 rushing yards as his player prop. In comparison to Elijah Mitchell's up there at 575.5. So they are pricing in Elijah Mitchell having that role on first and second down here. And as we're on these player props, I do want to point out to y'all my favorite player prop on Underdog right now, going back to Ja'Marr Chase, is Ja'Marr Chase plus 25 receiving yards versus Davante Adams. We'll talk about Adams later on, but it's crazy that you get extra yardage on the Chase side. But of course, if you want to check out any of those player props, or if you want to get into a draft with us, which we are doing every single day on the live stream, you can find the link to Underdog Fantasy both in the comment section as well as the description. If you sign up to Underdog with promo code FLOCK, they're going to match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. You're going to get my 2023 fantasy football rankings rankings, a free trial to flockfantasy.com. And these are best ball drafts, so no time commitment at all during the season. That's how I drafted 700 teams last year, won $150,000. Not meant to replace your main fantasy football league, just meant to be some extra fun and help you get prepared for your main league on the side. But going over to our next guy here, we're going to be looking at Travis Kelce. Now, the more starting wide receiver slots you add on, the more flex spots you add on as well, the lower overall percentage of your starting lineup output is going to be accounted for by tight ends. So if you add more starting wide receiver slots, or if you add those flex spots, Travis Kelce will fall a little bit down these rankings. But nonetheless, we know Kelce is an extremely stable option, right? I mean, 3 straight seasons now, he's averaged the tight end 1 finish. I mean, this is a guy that went out there and had 2.4 yards per route run this past season. So I do think that there's inherently a little bit of downside with Kelce now that he's going into his age 34 season. But I mean, you can't really fade Kelce until he's actually done producing. Now, going over to our next guy, we are going to be looking at Mr. Tyreek Hill. With Tyreek, this past season, 100 receiving yards on a per game basis and a 29% team target share. This is better than what you had in 2021. This is better than what you had in 2020. So yes, being in the Miami Dolphins offense is better for Tyreek Hill than in Kansas City. To add on this fact, if you look at the splits with and without Tua this past year, you actually had Tyreek Hill as a much better option in games where Tua played. In those contests, Tyreek averaged 108 receiving yards per game in comparison to the 4 games with no Tua where he was only at 75.5. So if you assume that Tua plays a full season this next year, you should be really confident that Tyreek Hill is another wide receiver similar to Jefferson, similar to Chase, that has a 2,000-yard season in his range of outcomes. Now, dropping down to our next tier, we are going to have to move Cooper Kupp down here. Okay, I'm sorry. We've talked about the red flags previous to this. The reason that I've always had Cooper Kupp behind a player like Tyreek Hill is Cooper Kupp is a 30-year-old wide receiver with a quarterback question mark where we don't know the full extent of the health that we have with Matthew Stafford. And on top of this, if we look at Las Vegas win totals, they have the Los Angeles Rams at 6.5 wins, indicating that this will probably be a bad team this next season. On top of this, we're starting to see these red flags pop up that Cooper Kupp is now dealing with a hamstring injury and is going to be out, quote unquote, for a few weeks. Now, of course, this is going to be something that we continue to monitor. With that being said, we've seen very few wide receivers over the past 5 seasons have the same type of ceiling as Cooper Kupp, where back in 2021, he led the NFL in receptions, in receiving yards, as well as receiving touchdowns. In that season, he had 3.4 yards per route run. I've never seen that before, ever. So I want to be realistic with the range of outcomes with Cooper Kupp, but given the red flags, I just don't see him in the same tier as someone like Tyreek. I'm going to continue to take Tyreek Hill ahead of Cooper Kupp, especially with the injury news. Now, in the same tier, we are going to have Austin Eckler. With Eckler, he was actually the #1 scoring player out of all flex options this past season, but I do expect him to fall back down to earth a bit, right? With Eckler, he was in that 2017 draft class. He stayed all 4 years in college as well, so he's actually a little bit older than a lot of these other guys that we're going to look at. And on top of this, what I'm worried about is the receiving down usage coming back down to earth. His target share got up to almost 18% on a per game basis this past season, but I expect this to go back down to about 15% because the rise in Eckler's receiving volume is explained by the injuries that you add to the wide receiver room in Los Angeles this past year. This past season, you had 4 games with no Mike Williams, and in those 4 games, Austin Eckler averaged 10.5 targets per contest. In the 13 games with Mike Williams, he was down at 6.5 targets per game. We can see the same thing with Keenan Allen. He played 7 games with no Keenan Allen, where Austin Eckler went out there and averaged 9.3 targets per game. But in the games with Allen, he was at 6.2 targets per game. So clearly having 2 healthy wide receivers in Los Angeles is going to make Austin Eckler just is going to diminish the receiving role for Austin Eckler just a bit. And now you added Quentin Johnston, so the possibility that they have nobody else to go to probably does lower just a bit. Now, our next guy, Bijon Robinson, I want to put a big asterisk on because I am more biased than anybody you're ever going to find, okay? I would love to come out here and love to try to say, okay, yeah, Bijon, he's out running real routes at training camp. This is a player that can operate almost as a slot wide receiver with how good he is catching the football. He has the size to be a 3-down player. Hell, he's the best running back prospect we've seen since Saquon Barkley. Hell, Arthur Smith last year at the Atlanta Falcons at number 2 in the NFL for overall carries when they just had Cordell Patterson and Tyler Algier. So I want to sit here and try to give the most bullish case I can for Bijon, but this is a running back that I met at the NFL draft. I ran into at the gym a couple weeks back, and hell, I'm a former Texas Longhorn. So y'all know I'm going to be very biased. I honestly probably would not listen to me with my ranking here. Now, our next guy, Stefan Diggs, just a super safe option, right? I don't think Diggs is ever going to be that wide receiver that has 2,000 receiving yards in a season, but 3 straight seasons now, top 10 finish. I mean, the man's had 3 straight seasons now with over a 25% team target share, over 2 yards per route run, over 100 total intended air yards per game. So, I mean, this is about the safest option that you can find in this range. Now, our next guy with CeeDee Lamb is actually ascending, whereas obviously Stefan Diggs is a little bit more plateaued. With CeeDee Lamb this past season, with the departure of Amari Cooper, he actually had a target share of 28% in this Dallas Cowboys offense. His yards per route run went up to 2.5. He just got better across the board, which is kind of what you expected. And this may even be exaggerated in 2023 if we get a fully healthy Dak Prescott. Because in games that Dak Prescott played this past season, you actually had CeeDee Lamb at 18.5 points per game. Whereas in the games where Dak Prescott missed, you had CeeDee Lamb only at 16.5 points per game. So just by having a healthy Dak Prescott, you may just get an added on bonus for Lamb. And this is an incredibly young player. I mean, he's younger than someone like Kenny Pickett. Now, our next guy, A.J. Brown. With Brown, wide receiver 8 this past year, you're going to see some bigger spike weeks. Obviously, this is someone that's not going to command the same type of target volume that you're going to have with the CeeDee Lamb because you have Devonta Smith in Philadelphia. You have Dallas Goedert in Philadelphia. This is a team that's going to run the ball a ton. But also, this is a team that has the best offensive line in the NFL. This is an offense that I want to bet on leading the NFL in points scored this next year. You'll see that later on in this video. So, I mean, yeah, with A.J. Brown, there's not too much to discuss. I feel like we kind of know who he is, right? Now, going over to our next guy, we are going to have Saquon Barkley. Now, Saquon Barkley goes out there and gets the deal done where I guess he just gets a little more money and incentives. I don't really know why he did that, but nonetheless, he will be playing this next year. And the reason Saquon Barkley was one of my most drafted running backs on Underdog and why I was taking him nonstop at the end of the second round over and over and over again is he checks all the criteria that we look for. From a market share perspective as a receiver, he had a 15% team target share this past season. As a rusher, he had a 60% market share number, and that's including the Daniel Jones carries. This is also a running back that has not hit age 27, so he's still in that prime spot for running back production. I'm a little bit concerned about the offensive line. Hopefully, Darren Waller, Jalen Hyatt adding to this offense helps them stretch the field a bit where opposing defenses aren't able to stack the box as much on Saquon Barkley, but you never know. Now, our next guy, Nick Chubb. Yes, we'll be moving ahead of Jonathan Taylor. This is another update that we're having to make. Nick Chubb, he's the safe option. We know he's playing this next year. We know the Cleveland Browns have a great offensive line. We know that Nick Chubb has 3 straight seasons over 100 total yards per game, and you possibly have an expanded role as a pass catcher going into this next season with the departure of Kareem Hunt. If we go back to 2019, in those games with no Kareem Hunt, Nick Chubb actually averages 2.93 targets per game. Whereas with Hunt, he's only at 1.95. Obviously, not a dramatic shift, but I do think we can get the target share numbers up to 7, 8, maybe even 9% for Nick Chubb this next season. And if Deshaun Watson gets that bounce back, I mean, can be a very exciting player. Now, our next guy is extremely risky. And at the time of this recording, we don't know what's happening with Jonathan Taylor. With Taylor, I stand by the fact that he checks those boxes we look for. He is the sweet spot in age. This is a running back that has the market share numbers we want as a rusher, 67% this past season on a per game basis. As a receiver, 10.5% on a per game basis this past year for his target share. He is an elite athlete. He has the size to be a bell cow. In 2021, he averaged almost 130 total yards per game. I don't know what the situation will be this next year. I don't know if he's going to be in Indianapolis. I don't know if he's going to be with another team. And I understand by ranking him at this point, we are taking on a lot of risk. But in fantasy football, where you are in a 12-team league and there's one person who wins it and there are 11 people that lose it, I am willing to lean and take that risk for upside. So that's why I'm going to go Jonathan Taylor here. And I know a lot of people that are a lot smarter than me would not. Now, our next guy, Tony Pollard, can easily jump Jonathan Taylor, right? Now, what I'm going to need to see is I'm going to need to see the Dallas Cowboys sit on their hands and do nothing over the next month. Pollard, running back 9 this past year. Ezekiel Elliott leaves this offense, and you want to assume that on paper, Tony Pollard looks like a top 5 running back going into this next season. Now, the reason I'm not going to move Pollard ahead of Taylor just yet is I truly do believe that the Dallas Cowboys are primed to be in a spot where they can add in another running back over the coming month. I don't know if they're going to be adding in Ezekiel Elliott, Leonard Fournette, Kareem Hunt, Dalvin Cook, or hell, maybe even Jonathan Taylor himself. But if they don't do that over the next month, I will tell you right now, Tony Pollard is going to jump ahead of Jonathan Taylor in these rankings and possibly be up in that same tier as Stefan Diggs. Now, going over to our next guy, we are going to be looking at Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry, across the board, when we did our offensive line analysis, looking at pretty much every resource we could find, it seems like every offensive line expert has the Tennessee Titans as the worst offensive line unit going into this next season. On top of this, Derrick Henry is now pushing 30 years old. This is a team where Las Vegas sportsbooks are telling us that they are going to be very, very bad. And those are 3 big red flags that we have for Derrick Henry, right? We have the age, we have the offensive line, and the overall offensive production. Now, with that being said, Derrick Henry just simply has to stay the same. If he stays the same as what he's been over the past 3 years, he will be a league-winning player at this price point. For the past 3 seasons, Derrick Henry has averaged 121 total yards per game. He has averaged the running back 3 finish. But going back to age and how Father Time always catches up with these running backs, if we look at running backs going into their age 30 season, where they had a age 29 year that comped to what Derrick Henry just saw on a per game basis, the first guy, Arian Foster, the following season, got injured and only played 4 games. The next guy, LaShawn McCoy, the following season fell from about 20 points per game down to 16.5. The next guy, Curtis Martin, fell from 19 points per game down to 15. Marshawn Lynch fell from 19 points per game down to 12 and got hurt. DeMarco Murray fell from 18.5 points per game down to 11.5. So what we've seen historically since the year 2000 has been running backs with this type of career arc at this age either decline in production or get injured. I'm not saying that's guaranteed for Derrick Henry. If that was guaranteed for Derrick Henry, I would have him a lot lower than he is now. But I just want to be realistic with ourselves and say that there are serious red flags that we can't ignore just because he's an outlier. And now with that being said, it's all about the price point that you're drafting him at, right? If you're looking at underdog drafts, in underdog drafts, you're able to get Derrick Henry at the beginning of round 3. And yes, if I'm going to get Derrick Henry at the beginning of round 3, I will draft a lot of him. I'm going to be honest, I will. Now, with that being said, if Derrick Henry is going in round 1 of your regular redraft format, it just does not make sense to take a running back with this many red flags at that price point. So I'm going to rank him in the middle of the second. I feel that this ranking appropriately showcases both the downside and the upside of taking a player like Derrick Henry. Now, our next guy will be Garrett Wilson, who should be at practice this next weekend, should be fine with this ankle sprain. Garrett Wilson, I want to outline how good he was without Zach Wilson this past season. I don't want to look at the overall numbers. Let's just dive into what you had with those Zach Wilson. In those 8 games, over 17 points per game, over 11 targets per game, over 80 receiving yards per game as a 21-year-old rookie. Now you're getting Aaron Rodgers added into this offense. If you're looking at Las Vegas win totals, they're telling us that the Jets are true contenders. So everybody knows he's going to take a massive step forward this next season. I don't think we have to talk about it. I'm just excited to see Hard Knocks. Now, our next guy, Monroe St. Brown, wide receiver 10 this past year, right? And if you look at the trajectory of Monroe St. Brown's career, you have guys that he comps to, such as CeeDee Lamb, T. Higgins, Amari Cooper, Brandon Cooks, Jarvis Landry, Allen Robinson, Kendall Wright, and Dwayne Bowe. Now, my favorite comp for Monroe St. Brown through the first 2 years of his NFL career and where this may be going is actually going to be Jarvis Landry. Now, I know a lot of people are not going to like that comp. I understand why, right? We just remember the end of Jarvis Landry's career. But if you go back and remember the beginning for the Miami Dolphins, Jarvis Landry is someone that you could pencil in each and every season for 100 receptions. Now, of course, the yardage is never going to be insane because he's that low average depth of target wide receiver operating close to the line of scrimmage. That's going to be racking up receptions, and in that full PPR format, he'll be great. So I do want to put a little asterisk here with the Monroe St. Brown and say if you're playing in a full PPR, super excited. Non-PPR, maybe move him down a bit. Now, our next guy will be Jaylen Waddle, my most drafted wide receiver on Underdog last year. One of the reasons we won $150,000. But nonetheless, I think that you can see the continued improvement for Waddle just if we get a healthy Tua, right? Because if you had the Tua season playing out in its entirety, Jaylen Waddle was averaging 17 points per game in games with Tua this past year. He was averaging 85 receiving yards per game. Whereas in games with no Tua, that fell from 17 points per game down to about 10.5. So if you think that Tua stays healthy this next year with the condensed target tree that these Miami Dolphins have between Tyreek Hill as well as Jaylen Waddle, I'm completely fine drafting Waddle. Now, our next guy, my quarterback one, is going to be Jalen Hurts. With Jalen Hurts, I know this is probably a little bit of a hot take. If you look at Underdog, right now Mahomes goes ahead of him every single time. I don't really care. If you also look at the player props on Underdog right now, they have Jalen Hurts at 10.5 rushing touchdowns. 10.5. If you look at any offensive line consensus across the board, they have the Philadelphia Eagles as the best offensive line in the NFL. So you combine an elite offensive line with crazy rushing statistics, with A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, Dallas Goedert, and now DeAndre Swift. I'm all about Jalen Hurts. He's my quarterback one. Now, if you're playing in a 6-point passing touchdown format, that's where I think you move Mahomes ahead of him, right? I'm going to be making these rankings for a 4-point passing touchdown league. And if we're going to be talking about the difference here, like if you go and look at these Underdog player props, they have Mahomes at 37.5 passing touchdowns in comparison to Jalen Hurts only at 23.5. But like I said, that's why in those 4-point passing touchdown leagues, rushing touchdowns are going to matter so much. But if you're in that 6-point passing touchdown format, honestly, you probably want to go with Patrick Mahomes. Now, our next guy, Josh Allen. I understand that Allen maybe was a little disappointing this past year where he had turnovers and he wasn't the MVP like people thought. But nonetheless, he still was the quarterback too from a points per game perspective. He's been the quarterback 3, 1, and 2 for the past 3 seasons now. He's still incredibly stable. You add in Dalton Kincaid, who hopefully can do something. Gabe Davis is still incredibly young. You don't really lose anybody here in Buffalo either. Now, our next guy, Ramondre Stevenson, will be a running back that skyrockets up these rankings. Ramondre Stevenson can move as high as 18 in that same tier as Jonathan Taylor if the New England Patriots sit on their hands. Very similar to Tony Pollard and the Dallas Cowboys. If things remain the same, I would expect currently Ramondre Stevenson to look like a league-winning running back in a full PPR format for the New England Patriots based off his receiving down usage. What I'm currently worried about is Jonathan Taylor, Ezekiel Elliott, Leonard Fournette, Dalvin Cook, Kareem Hunt. I think the New England Patriots could add in any one of those running backs and split this backfield down the middle. Now, our last guy will be the guy I want to root for the most. The guy I drafted more than anybody else in fantasy drafts last year, Mr. Josh Jacobs. He averaged 120 total yards per game this past season. I understand right now you have the uncertainty where maybe he's holding out. Maybe he's not playing this year. We don't know, okay? I don't know what's going to happen. If I was a betting man, what I would say is most likely Jacobs goes, I don't want to go to practice. I don't want to get hurt. I'm going to have to go and fight for my contract this next season. I'm just going to show up for the games. That's what I would assume is going to happen. I think these running backs don't have a ton of leverage. I think Jacobs will be a Las Vegas Raider this next season. But of course, I'm an idiot. At the end of the day, I'm just guessing here. Based off his upside case, I'm going to be putting him at 24, but there's also a lot of downside here as well. But I think that's all I have for y'all. Again, thank you so much for checking out this video. If you enjoyed it, go down there, drop a like, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. And if you want to get in a draft with us, we are drafting every single day on Underdog Fantasy. Promo code FLOCK gets you a 100% deposit match up to $100. Plus, you'll get our 2023 fantasy football rankings and a free trial to flockfantasy.com. You can check out all those player props there as well. My favorite player props currently are going to be Jamar Chase plus 25 receiving yards versus Devontae Adams. I also really like the Monroe St. Brown minus half a receiving touchdown against Pat Freiermuth.